Hi, everyone. I am going to share with you chemistry basics today in a section that we'll call the chemical basis of life. Our bodies are composed of chemicals, and every activity in our bodies is chemical in nature. It's important to know these things and become familiar with the language and concepts of chemistry, especially as we learn more about chemistry with embalming. And there are three basic principles to chemistry. The first is that chemistry is the science of the structure and interactions of matter. The second is that matter is anything that has mass and occupies space. And the third is that mass is the amount of matter a substance contains, whereas weight is the force of gravity acting upon that mass. And all forms of matter are composed of chemical elements, which are substances that cannot be split into simpler substances. These are elements such as oxygen and carbon. And elements are given letter abbreviations called chemical symbols. For example, O for oxygen, C for carbon. Oxygen, carbon, and hydrogen and nitrogen make up 96% of the human body. And the element can be divided into the smallest particle called the atom. Basic units of matter of all chemical elements are called atoms, and an element is a quantity of matter composed of atoms of the same type. The element oxygen, for example, is composed of the same types of atoms, specific to the element of oxygen only. Atoms consist of subatomic particles, including a nucleus, which contains positively charged protons, and neutral or uncharged neurons, and negatively charged electrons that move about in a large space surrounding the nucleus. So, where the nucleus of an atom contains protons and neutrons, electrons revolve around the nucleus and spend most of the time in specific atomic regions called electron shells. Each shell around the nucleus of an atom can hold a certain maximum number of electrons. So the first shell nearest the nucleus will hold 2 electrons, and then we follow what's called the octet rule, meaning that the second shell will hold 8, the third will hold 8, the fourth 8, and so on. The number of electrons in an atom of a neutral element always equals the number of protons. The atomic number of an atom is equal to the number of protons in the nucleus of an atom. The number of protons in the nucleus makes the atoms of one element different from those of another. Since atoms are electrically neutral, the atomic number also equals the number of protons. The mass number of an atom is the total number of protons and neutrons together. Atoms of an element that have the same number of protons but different numbers of neutrons are called isotopes. Atomic mass or weight of an element is equivalent to the mass number or to the average number, allowing for the relative abundance of different isotopes. If an atom either gives up or gains electrons, it becomes an ion, which is a charged atom. When 2 or more atoms share electrons, the resulting combination is called a molecule. A free radical is an electrically charged atom or a group of atoms with an unpaired electron in its outermost shell. Free radicals become stable by either giving up their unpaired electron or by taking an electron from another molecule. And free radicals are linked to numerous disorders. A compound is a molecule that contains atoms of 2 or more different elements. The atoms of a molecule are held together by forces of attraction called chemical bonds. The likelihood that an atom will form a chemical bond with another atom depends on the number of electrons in its outermost shell, which is also called the valence shell. An atom with a valence shell holding 8 electrons, or 2 for hydrogen and neon, is chemically stable, which means it is unlikely to form chemical bonds with other atoms. To achieve stability, atoms that don't have 8 electrons in their valence shell, or 2 in the case of hydrogen and helium, tend to empty their valence shell or fill it to the maximum extent. Atoms with incompletely filled outer shells tend to combine with each other in chemical reactions to produce a chemically stable arrangement of 8 valence electrons for each atom. So when an atom loses or gains a valence electron, ions are formed. Positively and negatively charged ions are attracted to one another. When this force of attraction holds ions having opposite changes together, an ionic bond results. Cations are positively charged ions that have given up one or more electrons, and these are what we call electron donors. Anions are negatively charged ions that have picked up one or more electrons, and we call these electron acceptors. In general, ionic compounds exist as solids, but some may dissociate, which means break apart, into positive and negative ions in solutions. Such a compound is called an electrolyte. Covalent bonds occur when 2 or more atoms share electrons. A nonpolar covalent bond is a type of chemical bond that is formed when electrons are shared equally between 2 atoms. A polar covalent bond is formed when electrons between 2 atoms are shared unequally, where one end of the molecule has a slightly negative charge and the other has a slightly positive charge. Hydrogen bonds occur when 2 other atoms, usually oxygen or nitrogen, associate with a hydrogen atom. Hydrogen bonds are weak and cannot bind atoms into molecules. They serve as links between molecules. They provide strength and help determine the three-dimensional shape of large molecules. For example, neighboring water molecules bonding to form ice. Chemical reactions occur when new bonds are formed or existing bonds break between atoms. The starting substances of a chemical reaction are known as the reactants, and the ending substances of a chemical reaction are known as the products. Metabolism refers to all the chemical reactions occurring in the body. And energy is the capacity to do work, and there's 2 different types of energy. Potential energy is energy stored by matter due to its position, and kinetic energy is energy associated with matter in motion. The total amount of energy present at the beginning and end of a chemical reaction is the same. Energy cannot be created or destroyed, although it may be converted into one form into another. Breaking down chemical bonds requires energy, and forming new bonds releases energy. An exergonic reaction is one in which the bond being broken has more energy than one formed, so the extra energy is released, usually as heat. An example of this is the catabolism of food molecules breaking down. An endergonic reaction is the opposite and requires energy, usually from a molecule called ATP, to form a bond, as in bonding amino acid molecules together to form proteins. Activation energy is the collision energy needed to break chemical bonds and reactants. Initial energy is only needed to start a reaction. Catalysts are chemical compounds that speed up chemical reactions by lowering the activation energy needed for a reaction to occur. A catalyst itself is unchanged at the end of the reaction. And there's different types of chemical reactions. And this just means that a change has to occur. The first is synthesis. Synthesis is anabolic, where bonds are formed when two or more atoms, ions, or molecules combine to form new and larger molecules. The second is decomposition, which is when a large molecule is broken down into smaller parts. It's catabolic, meaning that the bonds are broken. The third is an exchange, where both synthesis and decomposition reactions occur at the same time. And the fourth is a reversible chemical reaction, where the end product can revert to the original combining reactants. Within our body, we have inorganic and organic compounds. Inorganic compounds usually lack carbon and are simple molecules, whereas organic compounds almost always contain carbon and hydrogen and are combined through covalent bonds. So examples of inorganic compounds could be table salt, water, acids, and bases. Water is the most important and abundant inorganic compound in all living systems. Water is the universal solvent, and hydrophilic substances contain polar covalent bonds and dissolve in water, whereas hydrophobic substances contain nonpolar covalent bonds. The polarity of water and its bent shape allows it to interact with several neighboring ions or molecules. Water's role as a solvent makes it essential for health and survival. And water and chemical reactions. Water is the ideal medium for most chemical reactions in the body and participates as a reactant or product in certain reactions. Hydrolysis breaks a large molecule down into simpler ones by adding a molecule of water. Whereas dehydration synthesis occurs when two simple molecules join together, eliminating a molecule of water in the process. There's also thermal properties of water. Water can absorb a relatively large amount of heat due to a large number of hydrogen ions in the water. It also has a high heat of vaporization, meaning that it requires a large amount of heat to change from liquid to gas. Water is also a lubricant. It's a major part of saliva, mucus, and other lubricating body fluids, and it can be found wherever friction needs to be reduced or eliminated. And in chemistry, we create solutions and we mix things together in what's known as our solutions, our colloids, and our suspensions. The mixture is a combination of elements or compounds that are physically blended together but are not bound by chemical bonds. And the three common liquids in mixtures are solutions, colloids, and suspensions. A solution is where a solvent, such as water, dissolves a solute, maybe salt. A colloid differs from a solution mainly on the basis of size. It's large enough to scatter light. So you could think of trying to mix oil and water. You can mix it as well as you can. Oh, sorry, I skipped ahead. Suspension is the last one, and it's where you can mix things, but the suspended material can mix at first, but it'll settle out. And that's a lot like trying to mix oil and water. You can mix it as well as you can, but if you let it sit, it's going to separate out again. Other inorganic compounds includes acids, salts, and bases. And when molecules of inorganic acids, bases, or salts dissolve in water, they undergo dissociation. That is, they separate into ions. When dissolved in water, acids will dissociate into one or more hydrogen ions and one or more anions, which are negatively charged. Bases, when dissolved in water, will dissociate into one or more hydrogen ions and one or more cations, which are positively charged, and these are proton acceptors. Salts dissociate into cations and anions, and salts are formed when acids and bases react with each other. And when we talk about acids and bases, we need to understand the concept of a pH level. Body fluids must constantly contain balanced quantities of both acids and bases. The pH scale runs from 0 to 14, with 0 being the most acidic, 7 being neutral, and 14 being the most basic. The human body, the living body, typically operates at a pH of about 7.4. And this comes into play as we're embalming a body, because in death, the body will go from slightly basic to acidic. And so it's our job to try to keep the body in a stable environment. And so we use fluids to help keep the pH balance inside the body at a 7.4. So we talked about inorganic compounds of the body, but what about organic chemistry? Organic molecules are large carbon-based molecules that carry out complex functions in living systems. Organic compounds form bonds with 1 to thousands of other carbon atoms to form large molecules of many different shapes. Many carbon compounds don't dissolve easily in water, and they're mostly or entirely held together by covalent bonds. So the first one that we talk about are carbohydrates. Carbohydrates function as building blocks and as sources of energy. These include sugars, starches, glycogen, and cellulose. Some carbohydrates are converted to other substances which are used to build structures and to generate ATP. The the general structure rule for carbohydrates is when one carbon atom is I'm getting tongue-tied. The general structural rule for carbohydrates is one carbon atom for each water molecule. And carbohydrates are divided into 3 major groups: monosaccharides, disaccharides, and polysaccharides. Monosaccharides and disaccharides are known as the simple sugars. Monosaccharides contain from 3 to 7 carbon atoms and include glucose, where disaccharides are formed from 2 monosaccharides by dehydration synthesis. So this is when glucose and fructose form sucrose. Polysaccharides are the largest carbohydrate and may contain hundreds of monosaccharides. The principal polysaccharide in the human body is glycogen, which is stored in the liver or skeletal muscles. Starches are polysaccharides formed by glucose in plants, and cellulose is a polysaccharide formed from glucose by plants that cannot be digested by humans. The next organic compound that we talk about are lipids. Lipids are important for cell membrane structure, energy storage, and hormone production. Lipids contain carbon, hydrogen, and oxygen, but unlike carbohydrates, they have fewer covalent bonds and are mostly insoluble in water. They are hydrophobic. Fatty acids are the simplest lipids and are used to synthesize triglycerides and phospholipids. Saturated fatty acids contain only single covalent bonds between carbon atoms. Unsaturated fatty acids contain 1 or more double covalent bonds between carbon atoms. Triglycerides are the most plentiful lipids in the body and provide protection, insulation, and energy. At room temperature, triglycerides may be either solids as fats or liquids as oils. Phospholipids are important membrane components and they are antipathic, which means that they have both polar and nonpolar regions. Steroids have 4 rings of carbon atoms, and these include sex hormones and cholesterol. And then we have proteins, and proteins are significant to us as embalmers because when we embalm, we create a cross-linkage of proteins that help stabilize the tissues into an environment hostile to bacteria. Proteins give structure to the body. They regulate processes, provide protection. They help muscles to contract, transport substances, and serve as enzymes. Proteins are constructed from combinations of amino acids. When amino acids are joined together, a peptide bond is formed. And this results in polypeptide chains that contain 10 to more than 2,000 amino acids. The resulting shape of the protein greatly influences its ability to recognize and bind to other molecules. Denaturation of a protein by a hostile environment causes loss of its characteristic shape and function. Catalysts in living cells are called enzymes, and the names of enzymes usually end in ase, like oxidase, kinase, lipase, and so on. Enzymes catalyze select reactions. They speed up chemical reactions by increasing the frequency of collisions, lowering the activation energy, and properly orienting the colliding molecules. Nucleic acids contain genetic material and function in protein synthesis. They are huge organic molecules that contain carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, and phosphorus. Deoxyribonucleic acid, or DNA, forms the genetic code inside each cell and regulates most of the activities that takes place in our cells. Ribonucleic acid, or RNA, relays instructions from the genes in the cell's nucleus to guide each cell's assembly of amino acids into proteins by the ribosomes. So protein synthesis occurs through ribosomes in the cell. The basic unit of nucleic acids are nucleotides composed of a nitrogenous base, a 5-carbon sugar, and a phosphate group. Adenosine triphosphate, or ATP, is the principal energy transferring molecule in living systems. And ATP provides energy for muscular contractions, chromosome movement during cell division, cytoplasmic movement within the cells, membrane transport processes, and synthesis reactions. So whenever we watch that video on the changes in the body after death and rigor mortis, where ATP is required for muscles to contract, this comes back into play here. And so this is where I'll end the video. This was just a brief overview of the lecture that we had on Tuesday. And after the lesson, I hope that you'll be able to define matter, mass, and weight, recognize the 4 most abundant elements in the body, differentiate between atomic number, mass number, and define what an isotope is. We will compare and contrast ionic and covalent bonds, as well as hydrogen bonds. And I hope you're able to tell the difference between a molecule and a compound. If you have any questions, please reach out. And thanks for joining me today.